The glass of water was still trembling in my son's wife's hand when she said softly, "Please, Mom. Drink." Still, I kept my eyes on the rippling surface instead of her carefully rehearsed smile. As the light hit the rim, it flickered cold. Just like the voice that told me yesterday about the life insurance policy my own son signed. While the water quivered, I felt my heartbeat settle into a quiet, dangerous calm. The same glass that once meant love now tasted of calculation and price tags. That's when I lifted it slowly and set it back untouched, right in front of them both. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Margaret sat in her armchair, the faded fabric worn soft from years of use, a quiet companion in her home that now felt more like a cage. The steady hum of the ceiling fan above mingled with the faint chirping of birds outside, but inside, her thoughts were louder than any of it. Her eyes lingered on the glass of water Emily had just placed in front of her. The crystal seemed to catch the light in a way that made it look almost too perfect, too polished for this moment. "Are you feeling okay today?" Emily's voice was syrupy sweet, the kind of sweetness that used to make Margaret smile. But now, it only unsettled her. Margaret's fingers brushed the cool surface of the glass as she lifted it to her lips, pretending to sip. Her stomach churned. Not from thirst, but from the nagging thoughts that had taken over her mind since yesterday. The life insurance policy, the one Jason had taken out without her knowledge. She lowered the glass, setting it on the table between them. "I'm fine, Emily, just tired. Everything at home. Okay?" The question came out too casual, too rehearsed. Her eyes scanned Emily's face, trying to gauge her reaction. Emily's smile, always warm, never wavered, but her eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, seemed to linger on Margaret a moment too long. Emily's concern felt staged. "You know how it is," Emily said, settling herself on the armrest of the couch across from Margaret. "Busy with Bobby's school stuff and Jason's work, but we're making it through." Margaret nodded, not really listening. She had already heard these rehearsed answers too many times to care. What bothered her was the thought that Emily wasn't just trying to be the dutiful wife. She was playing a role in something much larger, something Margaret could feel but not yet see clearly. Jason had always been distant, but Emily had a way of pretending to be everything Margaret needed in a daughter-in-law, all while keeping herself hidden behind a perfect mask. But now, with everything that had come to light, Jason's policy, the hidden motives, Margaret wasn't sure who she could trust. Not even Emily. "Are you sure you're all right?" Emily's voice broke through Margaret's thoughts, a little more insistent now. Too insistent, as if Emily was trying too hard to make her believe it. Margaret studied her, tracing the lines of Emily's face, the careful, practiced gestures that had once been endearing. But now, they felt like a performance. Was Emily in on whatever Jason was planning? Or worse, was she the mastermind? "Of course," Margaret replied, her tone cool, dismissive. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest, trying to mask her growing unease. "It's just been a lot to think about lately." Emily nodded sympathetically, but Margaret could feel the shift in the air. Something was off. There was a layer of politeness, of concern. But beneath it, beneath the smooth surface, there was something more. A hidden agenda. The glass of water sat untouched, the cold beads of condensation forming a pattern on the surface, as if it were a message she hadn't yet understood. Margaret's mind was spinning. Was Jason so desperate for money that he was willing to make plans for her death? And Emily, was she really just playing the dutiful wife, or was she a willing participant in the betrayal? Margaret's fingers gripped the armrest, the need to stay calm, to stay composed, fighting against the panic bubbling beneath. She had been independent for so long, able to see through people's masks, able to keep control. But now it felt as if everything she had built was slipping through her fingers bit by bit. Margaret, Emily's voice again, softer now. But Margaret could hear the underlying impatience, the way Emily was waiting for her to respond. But what was she waiting for? Margaret's breath caught in her chest, and for a moment she was paralyzed with the realization that she had no idea what was going on. She could no longer rely on her son, the one person she'd always thought she could trust. And Emily. Emily was no longer the sweet, loving woman she had once been. Margaret? Emily's voice sharpened, no longer the concerned tone it had been moments ago. Margaret's gaze flicked up to her daughter-in-law's face, and in that moment, she saw it, just for a second, before Emily's mask slid back into place. It wasn't concern, it was impatience. And maybe, just maybe, there was something more sinister in those eyes than Margaret had ever realized. Margaret leaned forward, her heart racing as her mind fought to connect the dots. Emily was watching her, waiting. The polite concern, the sugar-coated words. Everything was a performance. And Margaret wasn't sure whether it was Emily's game or if she was being played herself. But one thing was certain. Whatever was happening behind the scenes, it wasn't for her benefit. And Margaret was done pretending she didn't see it. She stood up abruptly, causing Emily to flinch just slightly, her smile faltering for a split second. Margaret walked toward the window, her back to Emily, her mind racing. It wasn't just Jason. It wasn't just the policy. This was bigger. Emily had handed her that glass of water, but it felt like she was being poisoned. And Margaret? Margaret was about to find out how deep this betrayal ran. As she turned back around to face Emily, the words she had been holding in came out in a quiet, determined whisper. I know what you and Jason are up to. Emily's face froze, the smile gone. For a long moment there was silence between them, the weight of Margaret's words hanging in the air like a ticking clock. And Margaret could feel it. The shift in the room. The moment when everything would change. Margaret sat at Sarah's desk, the lawyer's office around her feeling colder than she remembered. It wasn't the sterile, professional atmosphere that unsettled her. It was the weight of the paper in her hand. The life insurance policy Jason had taken out on her. It seemed innocuous at first, just a stack of forms, but now it felt like an indictment. Sarah had already skimmed through the documents, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the edges of the papers, her usual calm demeanor masking the unease in Margaret's chest. So, as you can see here, Sarah began, her voice smooth but clinical. The policy is worth $3 million. Jason Collins is the listed beneficiary. Margaret's heart dropped. $3 million. It was more money than she could wrap her mind around, but the number wasn't the issue. It was the fact that Jason had gone behind her back, that he had made plans for her death without her consent, without even a hint of discussion. The betrayal stung in ways she hadn't expected. Her fingers gripped the arms of the chair. He's the beneficiary? She asked, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. But why? Why would he need a policy on me? Sarah adjusted her glasses and leaned back, folding her arms. That's a question only Jason can answer. But I can tell you this. It's a very large sum, and it's clear he's planned this for some time. The fact that you had no knowledge of it. That's concerning, Margaret. Margaret nodded absently. It wasn't the policy itself that made her feel sick. It was the realization that her son, the person she had trusted most in the world, had set this up, knowing exactly what it meant. He had been planning her death for years, hadn't he? She fought the wave of nausea that threatened to consume her. What do I do now? Margaret's voice was low, hoarse. The calmness she had once prided herself on seemed far out of reach, slipping through her fingers like sand. Sarah glanced at the policy again before looking Margaret in the eye. I suggest you consult with a financial advisor as soon as possible. You need to protect your assets. Immediately. This situation could get messy. You should also review your will and health plans. You need to ensure that no one can manipulate your decisions going forward. Margaret swallowed hard, the air in the room feeling thick and oppressive. She had always been careful, had always made sure her life was organized, her affairs in order. But now, nothing felt like it was in her control anymore. It was as if Jason and Emily had been pulling the strings from behind the curtain, and she had been too blind to notice. I need to act fast, Margaret said under her breath, her voice steady despite the fury welling inside her. If I don't protect myself now, if you don't act now, they could claim everything, Sarah interrupted, her tone soft but firm. Jason could force his way into your estate, using his role as beneficiary. The fact that you weren't informed about this policy puts you at a disadvantage. Margaret's pulse quickened. It wasn't just her money at risk. It was her life, her autonomy. Everything she had worked for could be taken away, and Jason would have no qualms about it. Was this the same son she had raised? The one she had given everything to? The one she had trusted above all others? The very idea felt like a punch to her gut. But no. She wasn't going to let him win. She wasn't going to let them win. Margaret stood, suddenly feeling the weight of her own determination. I'll make sure my assets are protected. I'll revise the will. She paused, her words faltering as doubt crept into her mind. But Jason, I don't understand. Is he really that callous? Was he planning this all along? Sarah's expression softened slightly as though she understood the weight of Margaret's question. I don't know, Margaret. I can't speak to his motivations, but the fact remains, this policy exists, and you're going to have to take the necessary steps to protect yourself. Margaret walked toward the window, her hand pressed against the cool glass, looking out over the suburban landscape. The sky was overcast, heavy with the threat of a storm that didn't quite break. Much like the storm brewing in her own life, she had to act quickly, decisively. She couldn't trust anyone, not even her own flesh and blood. Emily was likely involved in this somehow too. Her sweet, fake concern had made it all the more clear. But Jason was the core of it, wasn't he? This was his plan, his manipulation. Margaret turned back to face Sarah. I need to know everything. No more surprises. I'll get my finances in order. And I'll find a way to make sure Jason can't touch anything. Good, Sarah said, nodding. You have to be thorough. If you don't want him to take control of your life, your legacy, you need to move fast. Margaret's mind raced as she considered her next steps. Legal advice, financial advice, a complete overhaul of her will. It was all starting to feel like a full-scale war, and Margaret was ready for it. The quiet life she had built was gone. The calm, controlled existence she had always cherished had been ripped away, and in its place was the need for survival. But still, the question lingered. Was Jason's heart really that black? Or was there something deeper, something she was missing? She was almost afraid to find out. As Margaret gathered her things to leave, she glanced once more at the life insurance policy on Sarah's desk. Her son's name, in bold print. A life bought and sold, and Margaret was the pawn in his game. The door swung open, and Margaret stepped out into the quiet afternoon. But something inside her shifted. She wasn't leaving the office just to protect her wealth. She was leaving with a new resolve to protect herself, and to find out just how far Jason's betrayal went. She would leave no stone unturned. The antiseptic smell of the waiting room hit Margaret as soon as she stepped inside. It was a familiar scent, one she had come to associate with Dr. Shaw's office over the years. Nothing remarkable, just the clean, clinical reminder of routine checkups and quick chats. Today, however, The scent felt heavier, as if the air itself were thick with her mounting paranoia. She barely registered the receptionist's friendly smile as she signed in, her mind preoccupied with everything that had transpired in the past days. The life insurance policy, Jason's betrayal, the questions about Emily's role. It was a whirlwind of suspicion and doubt, and she couldn't shake it. No matter how much she tried to calm herself, the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong wouldn't let go. When Dr. Shaw finally appeared, his usual warm demeanor didn't bring the comfort it once did. His neatly pressed white coat and calming voice. "Margaret, how are we today?" Felt like a mask, another part of the charade she was now questioning. She had trusted him for years, relied on his steady presence through countless appointments. But now, all she could think about was the possibility that he might be unwittingly involved in Jason and Emily's plans. "Good morning, Dr. Shaw," Margaret said, her voice a bit tighter than usual. She sat on the examination table, gripping the edges with white knuckles as if it would steady her. Dr. Shaw smiled and made some small talk as he checked her vitals, his hands gentle and practiced as they moved over her, taking the measurements, listening to her heart. But Margaret couldn't focus on the usual exchange. Instead, she found herself wondering, was he really just a doctor? Or had he been swept up in their plans somehow? They had always been so friendly with him, so respectful, Jason and Emily both, acting as though he were a trusted ally. Could Dr. Shaw have been part of the scheme from the beginning, or was it simply that he never saw what was happening beneath the surface? "So, everything looks good," Dr. Shaw finally said, peering at her chart. "Your heart rate is strong. Your blood pressure is within normal range. I don't see anything alarming, Margaret. You're in great health." Margaret nodded absently, the words barely registering. "Good," she said. But it wasn't good. Not really. Not when everything felt like it was crumbling around her. "Dr. Shaw," she said suddenly, her voice quiet but insistent. "Are there any health risks you think I should be concerned about? Anything that could cause a policy payout to be triggered early? Something unexpected?" Dr. Shaw's brow furrowed in mild confusion, his pen pausing midair as he looked at her. "What exactly do you mean by that, Margaret?" Margaret hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. The idea of asking about a life insurance payout felt absurd, like acknowledging the elephant in the room that no one else was talking about. But she had to know. She had to be sure. "I mean, could anything in my health suddenly deteriorate in a way that would raise concerns? Or cause someone to act quickly?" she asked, choosing her words carefully. Dr. Shaw laughed softly, thinking it was a strange question. "Margaret, your health is stable. The chances of anything like that happening are very slim. You're a picture of health for your age. There's nothing unusual here. I would have noticed something." His dismissive tone cut through her. He hadn't asked why she was asking. He hadn't even seemed to notice the unusual nature of her question. Margaret's chest tightened. There it was. The subtle, unspoken truth. He wasn't asking the questions she needed him to ask. He wasn't probing, investigating, or showing the kind of concern she'd hoped for. Instead, he was treating this like any other routine appointment, one where everything was fine, where everything was normal. It wasn't normal. Not anymore. Margaret stared at him for a long moment, her mind running through the possibilities. Could he have been oblivious to what Jason and Emily were up to? Or was he simply playing along, just another player in their game? She swallowed hard, feeling a wave of anger and frustration rise within her. She had trusted Dr. Shaw, trusted him like a friend. And now she wondered if that trust had been misplaced too. "Are you sure?" she asked again, her voice catching. "You really don't see any warning signs at all?" Dr. Shaw, sensing her unease, gave her a reassuring smile. "Margaret, you're overthinking this. Your health is strong. There's nothing to worry about. Margaret nodded, but the pit in her stomach deepened. He didn't see it. He didn't know. He hadn't asked the right questions. He hadn't wondered why she was even concerned. "All right then," she said finally, standing up from the examination table, her movements stiff, her resolve hardening. She forced a smile, but it felt thin, brittle. "Thank you, Dr. Shaw. I appreciate it." He smiled back at her, still oblivious, still treating her like just another patient. But Margaret was done with that. She was done with everyone treating her like she was just another person to be cared for, to be pacified. She was no longer just a mother, a widow, or a client. She was a woman at war, fighting to protect herself, fighting to understand what Jason and Emily were planning. And Dr. Shaw, for all his gentle care and years of service, wasn't part of her battle. As Margaret walked toward the door, she glanced back over her shoulder at Dr. Shaw, who was already tidying up the room, preparing for the next patient. He was no longer the reassuring figure he once had been. The doctor she had trusted was now just another person she couldn't trust, another piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. She stepped out of the office, the door closing softly behind her, and a strange feeling settled in her chest. She couldn't trust anyone fully, not Jason, not Emily, and certainly not Dr. Shaw. And until she figured out exactly what they were planning, she wasn't going to rest. No more lies, no more pretenses. The storm wasn't just coming, it was already here. The air in Sarah's office felt heavier today, as if the walls themselves were closing in on Margaret. The familiar hum of the overhead lights and the rustling of paper were the only sounds in the room, but they did nothing to quiet the storm raging in her mind. Margaret sat at the polished oak desk, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she picked up the documents Sarah had laid out in front of her. It had always been routine, revisiting her will and trust every few years, making sure everything was in order. But now, as her eyes scanned the pages, it all felt different. There was a sense of urgency, a necessity to act quickly, before Jason and Emily could act on whatever scheme they were plotting. She wasn't just revising a set of instructions. She was securing her future, her legacy, and perhaps her very life. Sarah sat across from her, watching silently, allowing Margaret to take her time. The lawyer had been patient with her through the years, a trusted advisor. But today, her role felt different. There was no small talk, no gentle guidance. Today, Sarah was a witness to Margaret's metamorphosis. Margaret took a deep breath. "I want to make sure I'm thorough. I want my wishes to be clear. If Jason and Emily are found to have acted maliciously in any way, I want them disinherited." Sarah nodded, making a note on the pad in front of her. "Understood. We can include a clause to remove them from your estate if their actions ever cause harm or undermine your wishes." Margaret's fingers clenched around the edge of the desk, the words still echoing in her mind. Disinherited. It wasn't just a line in a will. It was a declaration. The ultimate severance of the ties that had bound her to them for so long. But it wasn't enough to simply cut them off. Margaret needed to ensure that the money, the property, the legacy she'd spent a lifetime building wasn't handed over to people who had manipulated and betrayed her. "I want to change the allocations too," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "I'll leave nothing to Jason and Emily. Instead, I want to set up a scholarship fund for Bobby, something that will help him with his education. He's the only one I trust now." She paused, the weight of the decision settling into her chest. "And I want to leave a substantial portion to charity, women's shelters, programs for the elderly, causes that matter." Sarah wrote down the changes, her pen moving swiftly across the paper. Margaret could feel a small sense of power rising in her as she watched the decisions take shape. It was a delicate balance, though. Every decision, every allocation would have consequences, Relationships would be broken. Families would be torn apart. Her fingers traced the edges of the paper as she thought about Bobby. Her grandson had always been her light in the darkness. He was young, but he had a bright future ahead of him, and Margaret wanted to be sure that, no matter what, he would have the opportunities she had never had. This scholarship fund would be her way of securing his future, a legacy of hope rather than greed. "Do you think this is wise?" Margaret asked, her voice quiet now. She looked up at Sarah, the doubt creeping in. Changing everything, disinheriting Jason, cutting him off completely. I'm not just losing a son, I'm losing my entire relationship with him, with them. Sarah met her gaze. "Margaret, you have to protect yourself. You've built this life on your own, and now it's your right to decide who gets to benefit from it. Jason's actions put you in this position. Your first duty is to yourself." Margaret nodded, but the sting of the decision still lingered. She had spent years investing in relationships, loving her son and his family with the best of intentions. And now, she was preparing to undo all of it. The very thought made her chest tighten. But there was no turning back. She couldn't let Jason and Emily take what was hers. Not now, not ever. As Sarah finalized the adjustments, Margaret found herself looking out the window, her thoughts drifting to the future. She imagined what it would be like to live free of the lies, the manipulation, a life where she could trust the people around her, where her decisions weren't influenced by the ones she'd raised. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. "I'm ready," Margaret said finally, breaking the silence. "I'll sign it." She stood, her knees feeling weak as she moved toward the desk. Sarah handed her the documents, and Margaret signed each one with careful precision. The weight of the pen in her hand felt like a declaration, an assertion of her autonomy, and as she signed her name, she felt the years of worry and fear begin to melt away. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in days, she felt a sense of control, something she hadn't felt in far too long. "Thank you, Sarah," Margaret said, her voice stronger now, more certain. This gives me peace of mind." Sarah smiled, but there was something in her eyes, a hint of something unspoken. "It's my pleasure, Margaret. You've done what you needed to do." As Margaret left the office, the cool afternoon air greeted her, but it didn't feel like the same world she had stepped into earlier. She was different now, changed. The trust she had built with her son, the trust she had built with her family, had crumbled. But the trust she had built with herself? That was something she could control. Something no one could take away from her. Walking down the steps of the office building, Margaret's heart beat steadily, her resolve hardening with each step. She had made her decision. The storm was still raging inside her, but for the first time, she felt like the calm at its center. And whatever came next, whatever Jason, Emily, or anyone else had planned, it didn't matter. Margaret was ready. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the morning sunlight streaming through the window, casting long shadows across the room. The familiar scent of coffee lingered in the air, but it didn't offer the comfort it once did. Her hands trembled as she picked up the letter from the bank, one of the many documents she had reviewed in the past few days, all revealing the same thing. Jason had been making changes to her financial accounts, adjusting beneficiary information, taking out more insurance policies. She had been right to trust no one but herself. It was time to confront him. The thought of facing Jason, of confronting her own flesh and blood, made her stomach twist. She had loved him so fiercely, so blindly, but now, she couldn't ignore the truth anymore. He had taken advantage of her trust, and she wasn't going to let it slide. Jason's call came just as she had finished rereading the letter. His voice, so familiar and yet so foreign, made her heart skip a beat. "Mom," he said, his tone easy, relaxed, as if everything were fine. "How's everything going? I've been thinking about you." Emily's worried too. Are you sure you're feeling okay? Margaret felt her blood run cold. The concern in his voice was a mask, a carefully crafted lie. He wasn't worried about her. He was worried about losing control over what he thought was rightfully his. I'm fine, Jason, Margaret said, her voice clipped. But we need to talk. Talk? About what? Jason's voice faltered just slightly, a crack in the facade. Margaret gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. About the changes you've made to my accounts. The life insurance policy. You didn't think I'd find out, did you? There was a long silence on the other end of the line, just long enough for Margaret to feel her pulse quicken. Finally, Jason spoke, his voice smooth and dismissive. Mom, come on, I'm just looking out for you. You've been through a lot, and I thought I was doing the right thing. I'm just making sure everything's taken care of in case something happens. Margaret could feel the heat rising in her chest. In case something happens? She echoed, her voice rising now. Jason, I'm not some old woman who can't take care of herself. You've been making decisions for me, behind my back, and I'm done pretending like I don't see it. Jason let out a sigh, as if he were the one being wronged. Mom, you're overreacting. I'm just trying to help. Emily and I want what's best for you. We're doing this for your peace of mind. Don't lie to me, Margaret snapped. You've been planning for my death, not my peace of mind. You've been setting everything up so that you benefit when I'm gone. You're the beneficiary on my life insurance. You've moved money around. You've changed my accounts without my knowledge. This isn't about helping me. It's about control. Jason's silence on the other end was deafening, and Margaret could feel the full weight of the betrayal press against her chest. She had spent her whole life protecting him, trusting him, and now he had reduced her to a pawn in a game she hadn't even known was being played. I've had enough, Margaret continued, her voice shaking but firm. I'm taking legal action. I've already spoken to Sarah. She's going over everything. You've overstepped, Jason. You've taken advantage of my trust, and I won't stand for it. Mom, please. Jason's voice softened, but it was too late. You don't mean that. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm serious, Margaret said, her words a quiet storm. I'll make sure everything you've done is exposed, and if you think for 1 second I'm going to let you take what's mine, you're mistaken. I've already made changes to my will. You and Emily won't get a cent. I'm done. Jason was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was low, a subtle threat lingering beneath the calm. You can't just do this, Mom. It's not that simple. You've always been a part of this family. You can't just cut us off. Margaret's heart hammered in her chest. You can't just cut us off. It wasn't a plea for understanding. It was a threat, one that sent a shiver down her spine. But she wasn't afraid of him anymore. She wasn't afraid of losing her family, not when they had already shown their true colors. I've already made my decisions, Margaret said, her voice resolute. You've made your choices, Jason. Now it's time for me to make mine. And if you have any decency left, you'll leave me alone. I won't let you manipulate me any longer. She hung up before he could say another word, the sound of the phone click ringing in her ears like the final nail in a coffin she'd been building for years. Margaret sat there for a moment, breathing heavily, feeling the weight of her decision wash over her. It wasn't just about the money or the insurance policy or the manipulations. It was about her dignity. Her right to live her life on her terms, free from the shadows of people who thought they could control her. As she stared at the paperwork in front of her, Margaret's thoughts shifted to Bobby, the one person who hadn't betrayed her, the one person who deserved to know the truth. She reached for her phone again, her hands steady as she dialed his number. He answered on the third ring, his voice familiar and warm. Hey, Grandma, what's up? Margaret felt a tear slide down her cheek, but she wiped it away quickly, a sense of resolve washing over her. Bobby, I need to talk to you. There's something you need to know. Something about your father and Emily, and what's been happening behind the scenes. The line went silent for a moment. She could hear Bobby's breathing, hesitant, unsure of what was coming. "Grandma, what's going on?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Margaret took a deep breath, the words coming out steady but full of weight. "You need to know the truth, Bobby. The truth about your father. And about me." The storm wasn't just inside Margaret anymore. It was about to break wide open. Margaret sat in her favorite chair, the morning sunlight spilling across the floor. But today, it felt like no light could pierce the heavy cloud of betrayal hanging over her. She held her phone in one hand, her thumb scrolling through Emily's social media feed, her heart tightening with every post. Family pictures, carefully curated moments of happiness and togetherness. Emily, looking picture perfect in every shot, smiling with Jason, Bobby, the whole family appearing so normal, so happy. But Margaret knew better. She had seen the cracks behind the carefully crafted facade. She had felt the manipulations long before the betrayal was laid bare in front of her. It was all an act. Emily's perfect, poised image on Instagram wasn't just about maintaining an image. It was a calculated attempt to manipulate public opinion. To paint herself as the doting wife, the perfect daughter-in-law, while behind the scenes, her real agenda played out like a twisted script. Margaret's thumb hovered over the phone screen as she studied one of the photos. There they were, Jason and Emily, arm in arm, grinning like nothing had ever gone wrong. And Bobby, smiling up at them like a child who hadn't a care in the world. Margaret's stomach twisted in knots. How could they be so calm, so convinced that their lies hadn't already been uncovered? Was this their way of making her look like the one in the wrong? She could almost hear Emily's voice, sweet as honey, telling the world that everything was just fine. It was the last straw. Margaret couldn't keep pretending, couldn't keep allowing them to run this game while she stayed silent. She sent a text to Sarah, her lawyer. "We need to talk. I want to act fast." Her fingers shook slightly as she hit send. The time had come. She wasn't just going to sit back and let them control the narrative any longer. She needed to take control of the story, of her life, of everything that had been taken from her. Just as Margaret set the phone down, the doorbell rang, breaking the quiet tension in the house. She stood up slowly, her body stiff from the weight of her thoughts, and walked to the door. There, on the other side, was Emily, looking every bit the picture of concern, a small smile on her face as she held out a bouquet of flowers. "Hi, Margaret," Emily said, her voice saccharine sweet, too polished. "I thought you could use some flowers, just to brighten your day." Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Emily, at the bouquet, the fake concern painted across her face. It was almost laughable. Emily was standing there, pretending to be the concerned daughter-in-law, as if she hadn't been behind the curtain, pulling the strings all along. Margaret knew better than to fall for the act. "Emily," Margaret said, her voice low but steady. "I saw the photos you posted." Emily's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered quickly, the mask snapping back into place. "Oh, I just thought it would be nice to share some positive moments with everyone. You know, things have been a bit heavy, and well, Bobby needs stability." Margaret's heart pounded as the words hit her like a slap. Bobby needs stability. It was a lie wrapped in a veneer of concern. Emily wasn't trying to keep things together for Bobby. She was trying to keep the facade intact. She was trying to salvage her own image while continuing her quiet manipulation behind the scenes. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she looked Emily over, seeing her now with new clarity. She wasn't just Jason's partner in crime, she was an active player in this game of deceit, a woman who played a part as long as it suited her. But it was all unraveling now. Stop pretending, Emily, Margaret said, her voice colder now. I'm not stupid. I know exactly what you and Jason have been doing. The photos, the posts. They're just another way for you to keep up appearances. I'm done with it. Emily's eyes widened, her mask slipping for just a moment. But in the next instant she recovered, her smile widening in what Margaret now saw as an attempt to regain control. Margaret, please. I'm just trying to keep things together for Bobby's sake, for all of us. Margaret shook her head, disgust rising in her throat. For Bobby's sake? She repeated, her voice sharp. You and Jason haven't done a single thing for Bobby's sake. This is about you. About maintaining your grip on what you think you're entitled to. There was silence between them for a moment, the tension thick in the air, before Emily finally spoke again, her voice defensive. You don't understand. You're making this harder than it has to be. We're just trying to help you. Margaret stared at her, and in that moment, the full weight of everything she had lost hit her. Her trust, her family, her peace of mind. She had been a pawn in their game for so long, but no more. I understand perfectly, Margaret said quietly, her words deliberate. And that's why I'm done. I've made my decisions, Emily. I'm going to make sure the truth comes out, and you can't stop it. Emily's expression hardened, the mask now completely gone. You don't know what you're doing, Margaret. You can't just expose us like this. Margaret stood tall, her eyes cold as ice. I'm taking control of my own story now, and if you think you're going to control the narrative, you're mistaken. As Emily turned and walked away, Margaret felt something shift inside her, a sense of power, of reclaiming what had been taken from her. But it wasn't enough yet. It wasn't over. Margaret needed to do more, take more control. She needed to reach out, to make sure the people who truly mattered knew the truth. She walked over to the phone once more, her fingers now steady as she dialed the number of her oldest friend, someone who had been through it all with her. Someone who had always known Margaret for who she really was, not the facade the rest of the world saw. It was time to stop pretending, to stop hiding. The truth was coming, and no one, least of all Jason and Emily, could stop it now. Margaret paced the length of her living room, the silence in the house almost suffocating. She had just finished sending an email to Sarah, her lawyer, outlining the next steps. But the air felt heavy with something she couldn't quite name. Her confrontation with Emily had left a knot in her stomach, and now, as she waited for the next inevitable move, she felt exposed, raw. The family she had once trusted with everything was no longer hers to lean on. The sudden ping of her phone cut through the stillness, and her heart skipped a beat. It was from Emily. Margaret's thumb hovered over the screen, her thoughts racing. She had expected this, some kind of explanation or defense, but she didn't expect the content of the message, a screenshot of an email exchange between Emily and an unknown recipient. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she read the words, each one landing with the force of a punch. The email was dated from just a few weeks ago, before Margaret had found out about the life insurance policy. We need to get her in the home as soon as possible. We can't wait much longer. The sooner she's in, the sooner we can access her assets. Once she's there, she'll be easier to manage. It's the best way for all of us. The message sent a shockwave through Margaret's body. She stared at the screen, unable to believe what she was reading. Emily, the woman who had appeared to be so sweet, so concerned, had been plotting to push her into a retirement home, a decision that would rob her of control over her life, of her dignity. Her fingers trembled as she typed out a response. You think you can control me, but you're wrong. I know what you've been planning, and I won't let it happen. Margaret's mind raced. The life insurance policy, the manipulation, and now this. Emily wasn't just after her money, she was after her life. She was trying to push her aside, to make her disappear so that they could take everything, And Jason had been complicit in all of it. As if on cue, her phone rang. Jason's name flashed on the screen, his number familiar, but now tainted by the betrayal. Margaret didn't hesitate. She answered, her voice cold as ice. "Margaret, hey," Jason began, his voice casual, almost too easy. "How's everything? Look, I know things have been tense, but we just want you to be okay. You're not getting any younger. You know we're just looking out for you." Margaret clenched her jaw. "Stop," she interrupted, her words cutting through the air like a knife. "I've seen the emails, Jason. I know what you and Emily have been planning, pushing me into a home, trying to control everything I have." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Margaret could almost feel the weight of his guilt pressing down on him, though he tried to hide it. Finally, he spoke, his voice strained. "Mom, listen, you're not hearing me. We were just trying to make sure you're taken care of. We're doing this for your own good. We want what's best for you." "For my own good?" Margaret's voice trembled with anger, but she was determined to stay calm, to stay in control. "You're doing this for you, Jason, not for me. You're trying to take everything I've worked for and put me away like some kind of burden." "Mom," Jason started, but Margaret cut him off again, her voice rising. "Don't mom me. You and Emily aren't looking out for me, you're looking out for yourselves. I've been nothing but a pawn in your game. You didn't just want my money, you wanted me out of the picture entirely." There was a silence on the other end of the line, and Margaret could hear the faintest sound of Jason's breath. It wasn't the same voice she had known for years, the warmth, the comfort. It was now cold, distant, and far too calculated. "Mom, this isn't what you think," Jason said, his voice suddenly pleading. "We're family. We've always been there for you. Just trust us. We'll take care of everything." "No," Margaret said, her voice final. "I've trusted you my whole life, and look where that's gotten me. I'm done with this, Jason. You and Emily are out of my life. You've shown me who you really are. And now, I'm going to make sure the truth comes out." She hung up before he could respond, the weight of the decision settling deep within her chest. She felt a sense of finality, like the door had slammed shut on everything that had come before. Margaret stood in the middle of the living room, the quiet of the house pressing in on her. Her mind spun with the revelations of the past few days, Jason's betrayal, Emily's manipulation, the lies that had been spun so expertly around her. It wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't even just about the life insurance policy. It was about control, about power, about the way they had tried to strip her of everything. She had to protect herself now. The war had already begun. Her thoughts turned to Bobby, her grandson, the only one she could trust. She needed to speak to him, to make sure he understood the truth. But there was no time for that now. The pieces of her life had been shattered, and she had to act quickly. With a steady breath, Margaret moved to the desk and grabbed the folder with the paperwork she had been preparing. She reviewed it once more, her mind clear, her resolve firm. It was time to take control of the narrative, time to make sure that no one, least of all Jason and Emily, could manipulate her story anymore. She reached for the phone again. She had one more call to make, one final step to ensure her safety and her legacy. She was no longer just the victim. She was the one in charge, and she wasn't going to back down. This wasn't just about protecting her assets anymore. It was about reclaiming her life. The house felt different now. The shadows seemed deeper, the walls thicker, pressing in on Margaret with every step she took. She had lived here for years, decades even. It was where she had raised Jason, where they had celebrated birthdays and holidays, where her husband had passed away. It was a house full of memories, but it had also become a prison, one built by the very people she had trusted the most. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the papers she had prepared before her, the will, the trust, the final decisions she had been putting off for far too long. Her fingers moved over the documents, each one a step toward reclaiming her life, her autonomy, her future. And yet, each one felt like another weight lifted from her chest, a burden finally thrown off. She had spent hours reviewing the legal documents with Sarah, making sure everything was airtight. The decisions had not been easy. Disinheriting her son, cutting off the family she had given everything to. But it was the only way. Jason and Emily had left her no choice. They had shown her who they truly were, and now it was time for her to show them who she could be. The last thing Margaret wanted to do was sever ties with her son, but there was no other way. She had given him everything, trusted him with the care of her life, and he had thrown it all back in her face. The man she had raised, the boy she had nurtured, was gone. And in his place was a stranger, a man whose greed outweighed any sense of loyalty or love. "I'm done," Margaret whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. With trembling hands, she signed the final version of her will. No more waiting, no more wondering. The decision had been made. Everything she had, every asset she had worked for, would now go to charity and to Bobby, her grandson, the one person who had shown her genuine love and care in recent years. He was the future she wanted to invest in. He was the one who deserved what she had built. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the signed documents in front of her. A sense of finality washed over her, but there was no relief. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt hollow. The decisions had been necessary, but they had come at a great cost. Jason and Emily had forfeited their place in her life long before she had signed the papers. The truth had been too much to ignore. They hadn't just tried to take her money, they had tried to erase her, to control her. And now, they would pay the price. Margaret stood up slowly, walking toward the window and looking out at the yard. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the familiar landscape. It was still her home, but it no longer felt like it. The betrayal, the lies, had stripped away the comfort it once offered. It was time for a change. Margaret had already started the process of moving. She would sell the house. She would find a new place to live, somewhere peaceful, somewhere she could breathe without the weight of betrayal hanging over her, somewhere she could start fresh. She had also taken steps to ensure her health care was in order. No more relying on people she couldn't trust. Margaret had made the necessary calls to set up new arrangements to ensure she would be taken care of by people who respected her wishes. No one would control her future again. No one. Her phone buzzed suddenly, cutting through her thoughts. Margaret glanced at the screen. It was a text from Bobby. "Grandma, I just wanted to check in. Is everything okay?" Margaret's heart softened at the message. Bobby had always been there for her, even when the rest of the family had turned a blind eye. He was the one person who hadn't tried to manipulate her, who hadn't treated her like a means to an end. She quickly typed a response. "Yes, Bobby. Everything is going to be okay. I'll explain everything soon, I promise." She set the phone down and returned to the table, feeling a renewed sense of clarity. This was her life now. Her decisions. Her future. The doorbell rang, breaking the quiet in the house. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, she walked toward the door, her mind racing with the possibility of who it might be. Her first thought was Jason, perhaps trying to talk his way back into her life. But no, she wouldn't let him in, not anymore. She opened the door, ready to face whatever came next, but when she saw who was standing on the other side, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't Jason. It wasn't Emily. It was someone she hadn't expected at all. Bobby stood there, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. "Grandma," he said softly, "can we talk?" Margaret blinked, her heart pounding in her chest. Bobby, the one person she trusted, was standing here, at her door. Was he here to find out the truth? Or had Jason sent him, trying to use his grandson as a pawn in their twisted game? She didn't know what to say. She had promised herself she wouldn't let anyone manipulate her again, but Bobby was different. He was the last thread connecting her to her family, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to sever it just yet. "Of course, Bobby," she said, her voice steady, though her mind was racing. "Come in." As he stepped inside, Margaret felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. The storm inside her wasn't over. It had only just begun. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the faint light from the late afternoon sun streaming in through the window, casting long shadows across the room. Her fingers shook slightly as she sifted through the pile of papers in front of her. Emails, bank statements, medical records, everything she had gathered in the past few days. Each piece of paper felt like a weight, and yet Margaret felt the need to comb through every detail, to uncover every secret Jason and Emily thought they had hidden. The truth was slipping into place, piece by piece, like a puzzle Margaret hadn't known she was solving. She had originally thought their actions were about money, that Jason and Emily were simply greedy, manipulating her for financial gain. But as the documents laid themselves bare before her, she began to see the bigger picture. They weren't just after her money. No, Jason and Emily had a far more sinister plan. Margaret's hand hovered over a set of medical reports, documents she had requested from her doctor. They showed a pattern of irregularities, things Jason and Emily had been privy to, things she had never told them. Her health had been used as leverage, and it was clear now. They weren't just preparing to claim her assets. They were waiting for her to become ill, waiting for her to deteriorate, so that they could cash in on the life insurance policy. The realization hit Margaret like a cold slap. Her heart sank in her chest as the implications unfolded. They weren't just planning on taking her money, they were planning on her death. They had orchestrated everything. They had put her in a position where they could control her fate, just long enough to reap the rewards of her passing. Jason had never really been worried about her well-being. He hadn't cared about the years she had left, only the years they could exploit. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She felt sick, but not from the thought of her health. It was the betrayal that twisted inside her, gnawing at her insides. The people she had raised, the ones she had trusted most in the world, were scheming behind her back, plotting her downfall, all while wearing the mask of dutiful children. She couldn't let them win. She couldn't let them control the narrative any longer. This wasn't just about protecting her assets. It was about protecting her life. Taking a steadying breath, Margaret reached for her phone, her fingers poised over the screen. She had already emailed Sarah, her lawyer, about tightening the protection of her assets, but now it was time to go further. She needed to revise her paperwork immediately, cutting off Jason and Emily entirely. This wasn't just about disinheriting them. She needed to make sure they couldn't touch anything, even after her death. Her fingers flew over the screen, drafting an urgent message to Sarah. "I need to revise the will again. It's more than just the money. I need to protect myself completely. They're planning to push me out of the picture entirely." The message was sent. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting back to the medical records. Her stomach churned as she remembered the days Jason and Emily had shown concern about her health, their constant assurances that they would take care of everything, that she could trust them. They had built their web of manipulation slowly, over time, turning her trust into a weapon they could wield when the time was right. Margaret felt the anger rising, her chest tightening with every thought of their betrayal. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. Her son and daughter-in-law weren't just looking to inherit her wealth. They had been planning for her death, carefully maneuvering their way into control of her health, her life, and her legacy. They had waited for the moment when her age and health would give them the opportunity to execute their plan, and they had made sure that once she was no longer able to make decisions for herself, they would be in a position to profit. Margaret clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. This was the moment. There was no more pretending, no more hesitation. She had to protect herself at all costs. She wasn't just protecting her assets, she was protecting her life. But this wasn't just about legal documents. It was about confronting them head-on. She had made her decisions about what needed to be done, but now she had to prepare for the confrontation. Jason and Emily would fight her on this. They would try to talk her down, to convince her that they were looking out for her. But Margaret wasn't fooled anymore. She would make sure they realized the truth, the full truth. Jason and Emily weren't getting away with this. Not on her watch. Margaret's phone buzzed again, pulling her out of her thoughts. This time, it was a call from Bobby. She hesitated for a moment, then answered, her voice steady. "Grandma, I know you've been through a lot," Bobby said, his voice concerned. I don't know what's happening, but I need to know if you're okay." Margaret closed her eyes, hearing the sincerity in his voice. Bobby was the only person who hadn't played a role in this deception, the only one she still trusted. "I'm okay, Bobby," Margaret said, her voice softening. "I'll explain everything soon. Just know that I'm taking care of things. But there's something you need to understand. The truth is, I'm doing what's best for myself now. I've had to make some hard decisions." Bobby didn't say anything for a moment, but Margaret could feel the weight of his confusion and concern over the phone. "Grandma," he said finally, his voice breaking slightly. "Please don't shut us out. I just want to help." Margaret's chest tightened. She had to be strong. She couldn't let her guard down. "I'm not shutting you out, Bobby. I just need to make sure that you're protected too. You're the only one I can trust now." The silence between them stretched for a long time. Finally, Bobby spoke again, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "I understand, Grandma. I'm here for you. Whatever you need." Margaret felt a tear slip down her cheek as she hung up. Bobby didn't understand everything yet, but he would. Soon he would know the full story. And when the time came, she would be ready for the fight of her life. She had already won the battle for control over her future, but the war was far from over. The living room felt cold, despite the warmth of the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows. Margaret sat in her favorite armchair, the chair that had once been her refuge, her place of comfort. Now it felt like a stage, the silence thick with the weight of what was about to unfold. She had invited Jason over under the guise of discussing family matters, but this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. Not anymore. Today, she would confront him, really confront him, about everything. The doorbell rang, snapping Margaret out of her thoughts. Her pulse quickened. She stood, every muscle in her body tense with the anticipation of what was coming. She opened the door to find Jason standing there, his familiar face betraying nothing of the conversation they were about to have. He smiled, the same practiced smile he always wore, as if nothing were wrong. "Hey, Mom," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "How are you doing?" Margaret held his gaze, her jaw clenched. "We need to talk." Jason's smile faltered for just a second, but it was gone before Margaret could read too much into it. "Of course," he said, following her into the living room. "I know things have been a little tense lately. But we can work this out, okay?" Margaret sat down on the couch across from him, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She took a deep breath before speaking, her voice cold and controlled. "No, Jason, this isn't about working things out," she said, her eyes locking onto his. This is about what you've done, about the life insurance policy, about the changes you made to my accounts, behind my back. For years. Jason's face went still, and for the first time Margaret saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt, fear, maybe even regret. But he quickly masked it, slipping back into the comfortable role of the dutiful son. "Mom, I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice casual, too casual. "I've been looking out for you. You've been through a lot, and I just wanted to make sure everything was taken care of. You know, for the future." Margaret stood up, her hand shaking slightly as she picked up the folder of documents from the coffee table and placed it in front of him. She didn't need to look at them again. She knew what was inside. But she needed him to see it. She needed him to see what he had done. "Take a look, Jason," she said, her voice ice cold. "This is the life insurance policy you took out on me. You're listed as the beneficiary. And don't tell me this is for my peace of mind. You've been planning my death for years. Don't try to sugarcoat it now." Jason's face went pale, his lips pressing into a thin line as he glanced down at the papers. He opened his mouth, then closed it, trying to form words that wouldn't betray him. But Margaret could see the panic rising in his chest, the lie unraveling as it hit the light of truth. I just wanted to make sure everything was in order," Jason stammered, his voice faltering. "It's not what you think, Mom. No." Margaret cut him off, her voice sharp. "Don't lie to me. I can't believe I ever trusted you. You've been planning this for years, haven't you? You've been waiting for me to get sick, so you could cash in on the policy and take everything. It was never about taking care of me. It was about taking from me." Jason's face twisted, a mixture of defensiveness and frustration. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly. We were just trying to do the right thing. We didn't want you to be a burden. We wanted you to have peace of mind. We just wanted what was best for you." Margaret's hands clenched into fists, the anger rising from deep inside her. "You wanted what was best for me?" she echoed, her voice rising. "You wanted me out of the way. You wanted me gone, Jason. And I'm done with your lies. I'm done pretending like I don't see what you and Emily have been doing." Jason stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor, his expression now a mixture of anger and panic. "This isn't how it's supposed to go, Mom. You can't just turn on us like this. We're family." His voice cracked on the last word, his mask slipping further. Margaret remained standing, her eyes unwavering. "Family?" she repeated, her voice low and filled with a quiet fury. "Family doesn't manipulate. Family doesn't plan your death behind your back. You and Emily." She spat out her name like venom. "You're not family anymore. You've shown me who you really are, and I can't trust you. Not anymore." Jason took a step forward, his hands raised as if to placate her. But Margaret was done. She had seen enough, known enough, to know that this conversation was over. "You're not welcome here anymore, Jason," Margaret said, her voice steady, every word deliberate. "I've cut you out of my life. You're no longer part of this family. And when the truth comes out, you'll be the one left with nothing." Jason's face twisted with rage, his fists clenched at his sides, but Margaret stood her ground. She had nothing left to say to him. This was it. The final goodbye. He opened his mouth to respond, but Margaret didn't wait. She turned her back to him, walking toward the door. She didn't need to hear his excuses anymore. She didn't need to hear anything else he had to say. "Get out, Jason," she said over her shoulder, her voice hard, "and don't come back." There was a long silence, but she could feel his presence in the room, the weight of his defeat. Finally, she heard the sound of his footsteps retreating. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving her alone in the stillness of the house. As Margaret stood there, the finality of it all settled in her chest. It wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the end of the life she had known. Her family was gone, but it was the only way to protect herself. She had severed the ties, and now she was free. Free, but alone. The storm inside her had calmed, but the battle was far from over. The late morning light filtered through the blinds of Sarah's office, casting long slats across the dark wooden desk. The room was quiet, save for the faint sound of Sarah's pen as she made the final adjustments to the papers in front of her. Margaret sat across from her, hands folded tightly in her lap, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. Today wasn't just another meeting. Today, everything would change. Margaret had spent the past few days carefully preparing herself for this moment, making the decision to sever ties with Jason and Emily, to strip away the remnants of her old life. She knew what had to be done, and she knew it wouldn't be easy. But it was necessary. For her peace of mind. For her survival. Sarah placed the will in front of Margaret with a quiet finality, as if to say, "This is the last step." Margaret picked up the document, her fingers trembling slightly as she skimmed through it once more. There were no surprises here, no more hidden clauses or fine print to sift through. She had seen it all before, but today, it felt different. Today, it wasn't just paperwork. It was her future. Jason and Emily were gone. The assets were protected. The legal loopholes had been sealed, and now all that was left was to make it official. Margaret's gaze lingered on the section that disinherited Jason and Emily, her son, the man she had raised with all the love she could give, now erased from her life entirely. The thought stung more than she had anticipated, but she had no choice. They had given her no choice. She didn't want this. She didn't want to be in this position. But Jason and Emily had pushed her into a corner, manipulated her for so long that now she was fighting for the only thing she had left: control. Her control. Margaret exhaled slowly and looked up at Sarah, meeting her eyes. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady despite the torrent of emotions churning inside her. "Let's do this." Sarah nodded and slid the pen across the table to Margaret. "It's all set. You're in full control now. No one can take anything from you without your consent." Margaret picked up the pen, her fingers tight around the smooth barrel. She hesitated for a moment, her heart beating faster as the weight of what she was about to do settled in her chest. She had done the hard part, confronting Jason, severing the ties with the people who had once been her family. Now, with a deep breath, she signed her name, the ink flowing like a final act of defiance. As the last stroke of her signature hit the paper, a strange sense of relief washed over her. She had taken back control of her life. No more hiding. No more pretending. She wasn't the victim anymore. She wasn't their pawn. This was her life, and she was living it on her terms. Margaret sat back, letting the silence fill the room. Sarah was still watching her, her expression unreadable. "It's done," Sarah said softly. "Your assets are now fully protected. You've made the right choice." "I hope so," Margaret whispered, her voice small but resolute. She knew what would come next. The questions, the confrontation, the fallout. She wasn't naive. The family she had once known, Jason, Emily, even the distant relatives who had only shown up when they needed something, would all turn against her. It would break them, and it would break her. But that was the price she had to pay for freedom. "I think it's time to tell them," Margaret said, her words coming out more confidently than she felt. "The truth. They deserve to know." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure? Once you reveal everything, there's no going back. You've already made your choice, but it could hurt more people." Margaret shook her head, her jaw tightening. "It's already hurt enough. Jason and Emily have had their chance. They've already made their choices, and now it's my turn." She thought of Bobby, her grandson, the only person who hadn't tried to manipulate her, the only one who still cared about her well-being, who didn't view her as a stepping stone to something else. He deserved to know the truth, and he deserved to know why she had made the choices she had. But the rest of them, Jason, Emily, the extended family who had used her, abused her, they would have to hear it from her. She would no longer be the silent victim, hiding in the shadows of her own life. She would stand in the light and tell them exactly what they had done, the lies, the betrayal, the manipulation. The truth would burn through the lies, and nothing would be the same. "Okay," Sarah said, sitting back in her chair, her voice steady. "You'll need to be prepared for the consequences. People will question you. They'll want answers." "I've been questioned my whole life," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength. "Now it's my turn. I won't let them control my story anymore." She stood up, the papers now securely in her hands, ready to be filed away. She felt lighter. But there was still a heaviness in her chest, a weight that came with making such an irreversible decision. But she was done with the fear, done with the uncertainty. Margaret was going to take control of her own narrative, and if that meant losing the family she had once loved, then so be it. Sarah stood as well, offering Margaret a reassuring smile. "You've got this. No matter what happens, you'll be okay." Margaret nodded, though she didn't feel quite as sure. The world outside the door was still the same, but her place in it had changed forever. As she left Sarah's office and stepped into the sunlight, the weight of her decision still heavy in her chest, she knew one thing for certain. She was going to face the storm head-on. She had already walked through fire and survived. And now, she was ready for the next chapter of her life. One where she called the shots. One where she would no longer hide. The air in the courtroom felt thick, charged with anticipation. Margaret sat at the center of it all, her fingers tightly gripping the sides of her chair, her back straight, and her face a mask of calm. She had spent months preparing for this moment, but nothing could have fully prepared her for the weight of it. Standing in the middle of a battle with her own son and daughter-in-law, fighting for the right to her own life, her own decisions. The irony wasn't lost on her. They were the ones who had tried to take control of her future, and now she was fighting to retain it. Jason and Emily, Catherine as she preferred to be called, had filed a lawsuit, accusing Margaret of being unfit to manage her assets, of acting irrationally, of being incapable of making decisions for herself. They had pushed the narrative that Margaret was no longer mentally sound, that she was a danger to herself, and that the court should place her under their guardianship. The audacity was breathtaking, but it didn't shock her anymore. They were willing to do anything to get their hands on her money, to have her under their thumb, to control her life until she was nothing more than a shell of the woman she once was. Margaret looked over at Sarah, her trusted lawyer, who was scanning through the final evidence one last time. Sarah's face was unreadable, but Margaret could sense the quiet determination in her. They had a solid case. They weren't just going to defend Margaret. They were going to expose Jason and Catherine for what they truly were. Manipulators, liars, and opportunists who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. "Everything's in order," Sarah whispered to her, glancing up at Margaret with a small, reassuring nod. "We've got this." But Margaret's thoughts weren't on the court case anymore. They were on the fight, the emotional fight that had brought her here. Jason's face on the other side of the courtroom was enough to send a wave of disgust through her. He was sitting next to Catherine, both of them dressed in their finest, playing the role of concerned family members. But behind their polished facades, Margaret knew the truth. They were ruthless. They would use every weapon at their disposal to try to break her. Her mind raced as the trial began. Jason's lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man who spoke in smooth, practiced tones, painted a picture of a woman losing her grip on reality, a woman who couldn't be trusted with her own money, much less her own future. He spoke about Margaret's age, about her so-called irrational behavior. He spoke about her actions in the past few months, when she had made the decision to disinherit Jason and Catherine. He claimed that her decision was proof of her instability, a sign that she was no longer capable of managing her life. Margaret fought to keep her composure. She knew what this was, an attack on her character, a bid to strip her of every ounce of dignity. But she wasn't going to let them win. She couldn't. Not after everything. When it was her turn to speak, Margaret stood slowly, her legs steady beneath her. She was not the frail, broken woman they had tried to paint her as. She was strong, stronger than she had ever been. She stepped forward, her voice clear and firm. "I'm here today because I choose to take control of my own life," she began, her eyes sweeping over the courtroom, making sure everyone heard her. "I've spent my life giving everything I had to my family, trusting them, believing that they had my best interests at heart. But I've learned that not everyone who calls themselves family deserves my trust. Not everyone who claims to love me actually does." Jason shifted in his seat, his face reddening, but Margaret didn't let his reaction sway her. She had made the decision to stand up for herself, and she wasn't backing down now. "I know what they've done," Margaret continued, her voice steady, unwavering. "They took advantage of my trust, manipulated my health, and used my age against me. They didn't want to help me. They wanted to control me. They wanted me to be a pawn in their game, a game that they thought would leave them with everything." The courtroom was silent now, every eye on her. She could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on her, but there was no fear in her anymore, only determination. "I'm not irrational," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength with every word. "I'm not incapable. I'm here because I've seen through their lies, and I'm fighting for what's mine. I'm fighting for my life. And I'm fighting for the right to make my own decisions, without anyone telling me what I can and can't do." There was a brief pause before Sarah stood up, addressing the court. She was ready to present their evidence: text messages, emails, financial records, all showing the pattern of manipulation that Jason and Catherine had orchestrated. The court was going to see the truth, and Margaret wasn't going to let them twist it anymore. But just as Sarah began, the tension in the room shifted. A new weight hung in the air. Margaret could feel it, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Jason's lawyer tried to counter, throwing accusations of irrationality and old age at Margaret. But Sarah was ready. She and her team fought back with precision, showing the evidence that proved Margaret's decisions were based on her clear mind and sound reasoning. As the session wore on, Margaret felt the power of her words settling into place. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a battle for her life, her legacy. And for the first time in years, Margaret realized something. She had never been as strong as she was now. The truth was coming out. And no one, not even Jason and Catherine, could stop it. As the trial broke for the day, Margaret walked out of the courtroom with her head held high, her heart still pounding but filled with a new sense of purpose. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready for whatever came next. She had fought back, and now, nothing would stand in her way. The office was quiet as Margaret sat at the head of the table, the weight of the documents in front of her pressing on her chest. Sarah had gone over everything one final time, making sure the will was airtight, every clause meticulously crafted to prevent Jason and Catherine from ever getting their hands on a single dime of her estate. There was no room for error. Margaret had made her decision, and there would be no going back. She took a deep breath, looking down at the papers. The final draft. The irrevocable choice. Her heart didn't race anymore, but there was a subtle tightness in her chest, both a sense of accomplishment and an undercurrent of grief. The relationship with her son was gone, severed beyond repair. The betrayal had cut too deep. As she signed the last page, her hand moved with precision. This was no longer just about money. This was about something far more significant. Her dignity, her independence, and the life she had fought to protect. Done, Margaret said, her voice steady as she put down the pen. Sarah's eyes flicked to the papers, and she nodded. It's done. You've protected everything. It's all secure now. Margaret's gaze shifted to the corner of the room, where a framed photo of Bobby rested on the shelf. His smile, wide and full of promise, tugged at her heart. He had been the only one who had truly cared, the only one who had never tried to manipulate her for personal gain. And now, it was his future she was fighting for. She had made the right choice, but the consequences of her actions would be permanent. She couldn't protect Jason from the fallout, and she wouldn't. The price of betrayal was high, and it was time he paid it. Margaret stood, her hand resting on the papers for a moment longer, her thoughts turning to Bobby's future. She had set up a generous scholarship fund in his name, something to ensure his education was never in jeopardy, a future built on his own merit, not on the manipulations of others. No one would ever be able to take that from him. She'd also established a charitable fund for elderly women in need, those who had been forgotten, neglected, and left behind, much like she had nearly been. That legacy, too, would live on, long after she was gone. She couldn't save everyone, but she could make a difference, a lasting one. Bobby's going to be fine, she whispered to herself, more as reassurance than a statement. But it wasn't just about Bobby. It was about the kind of legacy Margaret would leave behind, one rooted in integrity, not greed. One built on self-respect and the courage to stand up for herself, even when it meant losing everything she once thought she held dear. "Are you ready for the next step?" Sarah asked, breaking her reverie. Margaret nodded, her resolve as firm as ever. "I've already made the arrangements. Everything's in place. Now it's time to move on." Sarah's face softened and she smiled, a rare expression of pride. "You've come a long way, Margaret. You've done something most people would never have the strength to do." Margaret gave a small smile, a tight-lipped thing that didn't quite reach her eyes. It wasn't about strength. It was about survival. She glanced at the clock. The morning had slipped into afternoon, and the reality of what lay ahead began to sink in. Jason and Catherine would realize, sooner or later, the extent of their loss. The estate they had thought would be theirs was now out of their reach. The life they had tried to control, her life, was no longer theirs to dictate, and Margaret knew it would break them. It had to. She had seen their true nature, selfish, manipulative, entitled, and now they would be forced to face the consequences of their actions. "Sarah," Margaret began, her voice suddenly softer, "I've been thinking about Jason." Sarah raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. "I don't think he ever understood me. Not really. Not the way Bobby does. Jason saw me as a means to an end. Emily, Catherine, she was just a tool for him. And now they'll see everything slip away piece by piece. The money, the control. They'll realize the price of their greed." Sarah nodded, her expression neutral. "They will, and they'll have no one to blame but themselves." Margaret stood and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. The world outside seemed the same, but she knew everything had changed. She wasn't the same woman who had entered that courtroom, terrified of what her own family had become. She was no longer their victim. She was the author of her own story. And soon, the world would know exactly what Jason and Catherine had tried to do to her. The truth was coming, and it would burn through the lies they had spun. But there was still more to do, more to prepare. Her fight was far from over, but for the first time in years, Margaret felt an unfamiliar sensation: peace. She had finally taken control, and she wasn't going to let go. Later that evening, Margaret received the news she had been waiting for. Bobby had been accepted into a prestigious school, a scholarship, entirely funded by her. It was the first of many steps toward the future she had worked so hard to secure for him, and for herself. As Margaret stood in her living room, the silence surrounding her no longer felt oppressive. It felt like freedom. The legacy she would leave behind wasn't the one Jason and Catherine had envisioned. It wasn't a legacy of control and greed. It was a legacy of love, integrity, and the quiet strength of a woman who had reclaimed everything she had lost. And Jason? Catherine? They would soon find out how little they had left. The storm wasn't over, but Margaret had weathered it, and the skies ahead were clear. The small apartment felt different. The walls were the same, the floors still held the weight of her footsteps, but the air, light, open, and free, was new. Margaret stood at the window of her new place, gazing out over the bustling streets below, the sunlight casting a warm glow across the city. It was a place all her own now, a place where she could finally breathe without the toxic presence of Jason and Catherine looming over her. She had left the house behind, the one that had once been filled with memories but now felt more like a prison than a home. The decision had been hard, but it was the right one. As she unpacked the last of her things, Margaret felt a quiet sense of peace settle in her bones. The boxes, filled with years of possessions, memories, and old clutter, were finally put away. The space, once bare, was slowly becoming her sanctuary. She didn't need much, just enough to feel at home. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Bobby standing there, his face alight with a warmth that had always made her heart swell with pride. He was no longer the boy she had watched grow up. He was becoming a man. But to her, he would always be that same sweet, caring grandson who had never judged her, who had always believed in her. "Grandma!" Bobby exclaimed, stepping inside with a huge smile. "I wanted to show you something." Margaret stepped aside, allowing him to enter. "What is it, Bobby?" He handed her a large envelope, his excitement practically palpable. "It's the letter. The school I've been applying to. They accepted me." Margaret's heart skipped a beat as she tore open the envelope and pulled out the letter. The words swam in front of her eyes as she read the acceptance letter from the prestigious university. Her hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming joy and pride she felt for him. "I knew you could do it," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Bobby beamed, his eyes shining with gratitude. "You've always believed in me, Grandma. You're the reason I've been able to get this far. I want you to know how much this means to me. I won't forget it." Margaret pulled him into an embrace, holding him tight. He had never asked for anything in return for his love and loyalty. He was the one bright light in her life, the one person who hadn't betrayed her. And now, she could give him the future he deserved. A future where he could stand on his own, but with the solid foundation of love and support that she had given him. As she pulled away, wiping a tear from her eye, Bobby smiled. "I want you to know, Grandma, I've learned so much from you. How to be strong, how to stand up for what's right. You're my hero." Margaret's heart swelled. She had raised Jason, poured all her energy into making sure he had everything, but it was Bobby who truly understood the meaning of family, of loyalty, of love. "Well," she said, smiling back at him, "if I'm your hero, you're mine too." Bobby laughed, sitting down on the couch. He began to tell her about all his plans for the future, his excitement palpable in every word. And as she listened, Margaret realized that she had given him more than just a scholarship or material support. She had given him the knowledge that no one, no family member or stranger, could ever take away his worth, his integrity, or his ability to control his own life. A few weeks later, Margaret sat at her desk in the corner of the apartment, the soft hum of the city just beyond the window. She had begun writing her memoir, the one she had promised herself she would finish. The words came slowly at first, but then they poured out in a flood, recounting her journey of survival, betrayal, and ultimately, independence. It was more than just a record of her life, it was a message to anyone who had ever felt trapped, who had ever felt like they couldn't break free from the weight of someone else's expectations. She wrote about her rise from the ashes of betrayal, the painful choices she had made, and the quiet strength she had discovered in herself. She wrote about Jason and Catherine, their manipulations, and the price they paid for underestimating her. But most of all, she wrote about her journey to reclaim her life and her power. Months passed, and Margaret's life began to shift in ways she had never imagined. She had been invited to speak at events, first locally, and then nationally, sharing her story of overcoming betrayal, regaining control of her finances, and taking ownership of her future. She spoke about the importance of financial independence, about the power of setting boundaries, and about the strength it took to confront the truth, even when it meant losing everything you thought you held dear. At one event, after a particularly stirring speech, a woman approached her with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," the woman whispered. "You've given me the courage to take control of my own life. I thought I was alone, but now I know I'm not." Margaret smiled, her heart full. "You're never alone," she replied. She began to receive letters and messages from people all over the world, women, men, children, thanking her for her courage, for inspiring them to take back their lives, for showing them that it was never too late to begin again. These messages, these stories, were more powerful than anything Margaret could have hoped for. Her life had become something she had never imagined, a beacon of hope for others. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt a profound sense of peace. She had done the right thing. She had taken control of her life and, in doing so, had given others the permission to do the same. As the years passed, the city outside her window continued to grow, evolve, and change. But for Margaret, her journey was complete. She had faced the darkness, walked through fire, and emerged stronger than ever. She had lost her family, but she had gained something far more valuable: freedom. And now, every day was a testament to her strength, to her resilience, and to the truth she had fought so hard to live. Margaret sat by her window, the sun beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the horizon. She was no longer afraid. And she would never be again. Margaret sat in the crowded auditorium, her heart swelling with pride as she watched Bobby walk across the stage. The bright lights illuminated his face, a mixture of accomplishment and excitement. He had done it. Her grandson, her reason for fighting, her anchor in a storm of betrayal, was about to graduate from college with honors. She had always known he could do it. Despite the manipulations of the past, Bobby had always been the one to keep her grounded, the one who reminded her that love could still thrive, even when family had failed her. Now, as she watched him accept his diploma, she felt the full weight of what she had built for him. The scholarship, the opportunities, the life she had ensured he could have, these were the fruits of her labor, her sacrifices. The crowd erupted in applause, and Margaret clapped along, her hands shaking with the quiet joy of knowing that all she had worked for had come to fruition. As Bobby took his seat, the speaker at the podium began to speak. Margaret's attention snapped back to him as he recited a quote from Margaret's own blog, a piece she had written about her journey and the power of reclaiming one's life. "Sometimes your bloodline ends with betrayal, but your legacy begins with love," the speaker said, his voice resonating in the silence that followed. Margaret's breath caught in her chest. The words, her words, had made it this far. She had never imagined that the small blog she had started, writing about her journey of survival and independence, would have such an impact. But now, here they were, spoken aloud in front of a crowd full of people. The truth of her experience, her pain, her strength, being shared with the world. The room seemed to shift around her as she looked at Bobby, his eyes shining with pride. He was her legacy now. Not Jason, not Catherine, but Bobby. He was the future she had fought for, the one she had given everything to protect. After the ceremony, Margaret made her way through the crowded hall, her eyes scanning for Bobby. When she finally found him, his arms were open before she could even reach him. "Grandma," Bobby said, enveloping her in a tight hug. "You made it." "I wouldn't have missed it for the world," Margaret replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." Bobby pulled away slightly, a grin spreading across his face. "I couldn't have done it without you. I never could have made it this far if you didn't believe in me." Margaret smiled, the ache in her heart growing. "You've always believed in yourself, Bobby. I just gave you a little push." They walked out of the auditorium together, the warm afternoon sun greeting them as they left the building. The world felt different now, lighter. The weight of the years of betrayal and manipulation was finally starting to lift, replaced by the new life Margaret had chosen for herself. That evening, back at her apartment, Margaret sat on the small balcony overlooking the city as the sun dipped below the horizon. The porch lights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the world outside. She sipped her tea, her gaze distant as she reflected on how far she had come. The apartment was quiet, save for the sound of the city around her, but it was a peaceful quiet. A quiet she had earned. She thought about the battles, about the choices she had made, the difficult paths she had taken to get here. It wasn't easy, and it had cost her more than she had ever imagined, but in the end, it had been worth it. She had fought for her life, for her peace, and for her future. Her mind wandered back to the journey, the years of manipulation by Jason and Catherine, the slow realization of the truth, the painful confrontation, and the eventual severing of ties. And yet, in the midst of it all, she had found something unexpected. Herself. Margaret smiled softly as she reached for her journal, the one she had kept since the beginning of her fight. She had written every word with purpose, knowing that one day the story of her survival would inspire others. She opened it to a fresh page and began to write her final entry. "I survived twice. Once when I was lost in the shadows of betrayal, and again when I stepped into the light of my own truth. I've fought, I've bled, I've lost, and I've gained. But through it all, I found my strength. I am no longer the woman who stood in the dark, afraid of what would come next. I am the woman who chose herself, who chose freedom. And nothing, nothing will ever take that from me." Margaret paused, her pen hovering over the page. She felt a sense of finality in that moment, a quiet peace settling in her chest. She had fought hard and she had won. The power to control her life, her future, had always been hers, and now she would never relinquish it again. With a deep breath, Margaret finished the sentence. "When my son took out a life policy on me, I knew it was time to take control of my life. I cut them out and healed in peace, a peace they'll never touch." She set down the pen, staring at the words. There was no bitterness in her heart now, only relief. She had taken control of her destiny, and as she sat in the quiet of her apartment, looking out over the city, Margaret knew that the storm had passed. She had weathered it all, and now she could finally live the life she had always deserved. Free. Free at last.